She avoided everyone until she walked straight across the boardroom and pulled the millionaire's tie like she knew him. Rain pelted the glass of the 23rd floor conference room in soft, steady sheets. Outside, the city blurred into streaks of gray and gold. Inside, the room smelled of polished wood and the faint, antiseptic tang of someone who kept everything perfectly in place. The executives circled a long table, voices low and confident, slides reflecting off the glossy surface. A woman with a cart and a mop moved at the edge of the room, methodical, almost invisible, until a small hand slipped free of a sleeve and a child suddenly ran. The toddler crossed the short distance with the ferocity of a ship in a storm. One moment she was at her mother's ankle, the next she was at the man at the head of the table. She reached up, fingers finding silk and knot, and pulled. Silence struck like lightning. Papers shuddered. A tablet skidded from a briefcase and thumped against the carpet. Heads turned. The tie trembled under the child's small, determined grip. He was Gabriel Novaez, tall, impeccably dressed, a presence people used to avoid meeting casually. For years he had kept a particular kind of distance. From every morning commute, from every corporate handshake, from the photographs that sat in frames with their backs turned to the wall. Now this tiny, trembling figure clung to the fabric at his throat as if it were the only rope left to hold him. He didn't pull away. He didn't smile. He didn't, at first, know what to do. His hand hovered, half outstretched. And in the pause, the room learned something about him that no press release could show. There was a thing inside him that responded to touch the way an old clock responds to a breeze. Slow at first, then finding its old rhythm. The child stopped crying. She lifted her face and, very quietly, began to sing. It was not a full song that belonged to a popular playlist. It was not a tune you would find on the radio. It was a low, circular lullaby, the sort of melody someone hums without thinking when they lean over a bedside. The melody was the smallest thing about the moment, and also the only thing that made anyone in that room able to breathe again. Beatrice froze where she was, mop handle in one hand, towel clutched to her apron. Her cheeks burned, not with shame so much as the sharp, honest heat of being seen. People in suits watched as a child whose life had been mostly corners and caution chose a stranger's tie and a stranger's shoulder like a landing place. The executives looked baffled. A junior partner whispered an awkward joke that had nowhere to go. Gabriel's tablet lay face down in the carpet. For a heartbeat, he stared at the tiny mouth near his own chest, at the way the child's fingers made the fabric pucker. Then he heard, behind the lullaby, a small, familiar cadence of words he thought he'd buried with other things he had tried not to remember. "Bring her to my office tomorrow," he said, not to anyone in particular. The voice came out thin and surprisingly steady. The room exhaled, unwilling and curious, like a crowd watching an act no script had ever called for. This is how the tie first held them, one small, insolent hand and a man's breath caught on a memory. Beatrice Almeida had become very good at slipping into corners. For 10 years, she had moved through buildings like a shadow that polished what others left behind. Coffee stains, the dust that gathered in the fold of a carpet, crumbs where conversations had happened. She had learned the routes that let her get in and out with the least attention. Her apron had a name tag sewn into the inside seam, but it was the kind of name tag you only saw if you were looking for someone to credit the shine on the glass to. She worked nights, mornings, afternoons, 3 jobs that braided together enough hours to keep rent paid, milk in the fridge, shoes on a small girl's feet. Before the mop, there had been a different rhythm. Beatrice had trained as a pediatric nurse. She had learned how to read the tiny changes in a child's breathing, how to fold a blanket in a way that promised safety, how to invent lullabies when none of the hospital's recorded songs fit the particular hush of a frightened child. She had held hands in waiting rooms and in corridors lit by fluorescent lights, and once, in the quiet after midnight, she'd watched a small body answer to a hand on a brow and settle. That work had given her a certain fierce tenderness that did not fit neatly into a uniform of blue scrubs or a cheap apron. The years had different ideas. There is a kind of fatigue that doesn't let you quiet down at the end of a shift. It follows you home like the sound of a train. For Beatrice, it was a series of small, stubborn blows, a hospital ward that had a permanence of sorrow, the endless paperwork that treated people like problems, a string of cases that asked you to keep carrying when your own muscles trembled. She loved the children, there was no doubt, but the system kept asking for more of her heart than the ledger of time ever repaid. She stopped taking night shifts in the wards after a series of losses that looked the same and tasted like fear. Nursing became a thing she had been, not a thing she was. She sang the lullaby then, too. It began as a way to steady herself, a private chorus that kept the rooms from falling into the noise. Later, on lonely bus rides and underneath the hum of fluorescent lights at the bakery where she worked mornings, she discovered the song could calm someone else. One child who couldn't stop trembling would quiet when she hummed those little notes. Another who had not slept in days would drift. The song became a bridge. Cecilia learned the tune while she was still small enough to nap pressed against her mother's chest. She learned the cadence of the words, simple, circular phrases with a little spin in the rhyme that made everything roll toward sleep. It lived in the way she reached toward familiar hands. More than anything else, Cecilia learned that music was a safe thing to carry alone. She also learned to be frightened in a particular way. Strangers were a noise at the edges of her day. Sudden hands, unfamiliar faces, even loud shoes could set off a tremor at the base of her spine. Beatrice taught her little rituals: where to hide her face if a voice startled her, how to hold a small toy just so. There were rules about being seen. Keep your voice low. Don't wave to a person who looks busy. Don't accept candy from people you don't know. Those rules are not cruel. They are the folded paper shields of parents who have watched a world that is sometimes careless. So, on that rain-gray morning when the janitorial bus was late and the bakery had been especially busy, when the neighbor who babysat had a fever, Beatrice packed a small bag, lined up the snacks, strapped on a baby carrier, and took the 50-minute commute up to the corporate towers with her mop tucked into the corner of the cart. She had done worse. She had, in a pinch, brought Cecilia to the hospital when a shift coincided with a babysitter cancellation. The boardroom on the 23rd floor felt like one more improvisation. If she had been asked later why she hadn't left Cecilia at home, she would have said the practical thing. The babysitter had phoned with a hoarse voice and said she couldn't make it, and the bread and the bills and the next month's rent were not interested in the reason. They were interested in being paid. The truth, lodged somewhere quieter, was this: she did not entirely trust the city to be kind to a small child who startled. It was better, sometimes, to be near and tired in a safe chair than to let the world slap both of them awake. Gabriel Novaes differed from the people Beatrice had learned to avoid. He moved like someone who believed space ought to be handled respectfully. His suits were cut so that every seam had a purpose. The office he kept on the 25th floor, just a few floors above the meeting room, was a study in controlled absence. One photograph on the shelf, a lamp that only turned on when it was needed, a plant he watered twice a week. He had once been an easy laugh, quick with a private joke and generous with introductions. He had once taken his daughter, Laura, to the aquarium and let her press her palms to the glass in a way that made her eyes shine like something someone had polished. After the accident, the slow, careful word for it was illness, Gabriel learned how to be alone without the dramatic gestures of self-exile. He began attending meetings less and making decisions by phone more. He kept a photograph in a drawer rather than on a shelf, not out of scandal, but out of the sense that grief belonged to a private room. He never stopped being meticulous about the small things, but the warmth that had been his was a dimmer switch turned down low. When the child found him that morning and the lullaby threaded the air, something in him unlatched. The song folded into the spaces of the past so quietly it felt like a scandal. It slid across the back of his throat and came with a smell he could not name. A hospital corridor, the hush of a night shift, the white noise of machines. He felt his breath catch. He felt the notorious straight line of his life wobble. The executives at the table murmured to one another. A junior associate, face still soft with the confusions of youth, stared at Gabriel as if waiting for permission to laugh. The laughter did not come. The child sang, and the tie under her fist was all the anchor she needed. Beatrice kept her hand on the cart. A single drop of rain found a new path down the glass, marking a line. She was conscious of how she had taught her daughter to be invisible, to fade into the background of a crowded place and only reappear when safe. That this child had chosen a stranger's tie instead of the most obvious safety, her mother's dress, felt like a small betrayal and a small miracle at once. "She won't let go," a steward who managed facilities whispered, and his voice was meant to be practical. It landed soft in Beatrice's chest. She stepped forward because mothers step forward. She did not push the child away. She did not yank Cecilia back in a panic. She approached with the same gentleness she had used with a child in a hospital bed. "I'm sorry," she said, breath loud in her own ears. "I'm so sorry." The child's eyes were closed as if the song had folded her into an island. The room, so much money and polish and presentations, seemed suddenly flimsy and small. Gabriel looked down and saw a face that he knew he once tethered to a morning with sunlight. For a thin, disorienting instant, he believed it might be Laura. Then he saw it could not be. The difference between memory and present hurt like a bruise. "She's all right," he said, and the statement was half reassurance and half command. He bent, and one hand smoothed a curl at Cecilia's temple, as if confirming with touch that the world remained intact. He had not touched a small child with such idle, quiet affection for a long time. When the lullaby faded into a hush, the executives resumed breathing, and the tablet was fished up from the carpet, its screen unbroken but somehow changed. No one in the room could have predicted the consequences of that moment. The sound of a child's song, the soft, stubborn pull on a man's tie, the folder-heavy shuffle as people attempted to push back into routine. Something in the air felt altered, like a window left ajar has altered the tone of the whole house. Beatrice gathered her cart. She wrapped a towel over Cecilia's shoulder to keep the damp from the rain from turning into a chill. Her fingers trembled the way they did in the first minutes after a long shift, when adrenaline and fatigue announced themselves at once. She had worked in hospitals where families made loud decisions about life and death, and she had learned the language of small containment. It felt wrong and dizzying and bright to be on this side of a room and still leave with the same mop. "Thank you," Gabriel said as the two turned toward the door, and for a luminous second his voice was unclipped from the formal cadences people expected of him. It was not gratitude in the way a donor says thank you. It was gratitude like a man who had been given a small thing he had forgotten he needed. Outside, the rain had not abated. The dojo thin umbrellas dipped like tiny black mushrooms. The city kept its business. Beatrice attempted to tuck the incident away beneath the practical concerns of a day's labor. A schedule to finish, an extra room to wash, an elderly building superintendent to remind about a clogged sink. But the tie clung to her thoughts like lint. That evening, in a cramped apartment that smelled of stew and laundry soap, she sat with a small radio on and a tray of modest food. Cecilia had fallen asleep early, small face turned to the pillow, thumb tucked beneath her chin. Beatrice traced a finger over the child's cheek, as if mapping the geography of a country she had promised herself to protect. The lullaby hummed itself in her mind, and she found, suddenly, that the melody kept her from letting her mind spiral to too many fearful places. Across town, in an office lit by a desk lamp and a city that did not soften into anything resembling consolation, Gabriel sat with his hands splayed on the desk. The tablet lay open, the screen still displaying slides about quarterly growth, numerical certainty. Yet the numbers blurred. He dug through the drawer of the desk on a motion half certain, half automatic, and fingers found a place he seldom visited. The photograph was a rectangle of warmth between cooler things: a committee report, a backup drive, a pair of cufflinks. He held it and let the memory rise in an instant that had no length to it at all. A little girl curled in someone's arms, hair caught like sun, eyes shut. A nurse, young, tired, with a name scrawled on the back in quick handwriting: Bia. The note had a date scribbled under it. He had not known the woman would be right there that morning. He had not expected a child's lullaby to fold so easily the distance between 10 years. But photographs have ways of telling you what you have been refusing to see. They are cartographers of the heart. For Gabriel, the photograph opened like a hinge and let the past swing into the present in the same small movement that a drawer makes when you pull it from the dark. The memory of the hospital corridor returned, but not bright enough to be cruel. He remembered a small body sleeping against his chest while machines made patient noises outside the door. He remembered the nurse's hand, efficient and strangely kind, smoothing a blanket, murmuring something that was not official policy but seemed to do the work of policy anyway. He remembered the lullaby, just a few notes, and how, in the nights after, the house had seemed too big and the sound of his own footsteps too harsh. He sat with the photograph and felt his chest tighten. There were many things grief had taught him: the economy of tears, the precise way a name can make a body go still. He was not a man prone to theatrical gestures, yet the image of the nurse, of a woman named Bia, standing years ago in a room where his life had split, made something inside him unsteady. He did not yet know what to do about that unsteadiness. He did not know if it deserved action or only the quietness of remembering. But the day had made a demand on him, not in the language of corporate duty, but in the softer currency of human need. A child had grabbed his tie. A song had placed itself against the hard armor he had worn for so long. That kind of crack lets in a lot of light. For now, the order to bring that child to his office had been said out loud. The sound of it still vibrated in the air between the desks. People would consider it a curiosity, possibly an anecdote to repeat at the water cooler. The cleaner's daughter who liked suits. But to him, the words carried a weight that was not charitable. They were not a check to be written. They were, he discovered, an invitation he didn't know how to refuse. Outside the window, rain tracked the glass like fingers writing messages meant for those who would stop and read them. Inside, both of them, woman with her mop, man with his photograph, settled into the ways they had always known how: practical measures, small routines, the slow making of evenings that held space for sleep. And yet, the tie looped through the memory like a quiet symbol, an anchor and a knot, something that could be held and something that could be loosened. It had been pulled by a small hand without intent, and now it dangled between two lives like an unanswered question. If coincidence was a word that made people feel foolish, then perhaps it was the word they would use. If fate was a word that asked too much of a moment, then perhaps they would not say it aloud. Better to leave the moment as it was, an event that had weight enough to make them notice. The rain continued. The city made its evening noises. In a small apartment, a mother smoothed her daughter's hair and hummed the song the way someone polishes a silver spoon. The action itself mattered more than any shine it would bring. In a tower of glass, a man unfolded a photograph and tried to remember how to be more than a ledger of loss. And in the space between those two sets of motions, a tiny hand on a silk tie had made a claim that would not be dismissed by habit. If this story is touching you right now, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. I'd like to know who is meeting these people in your imagination. The next morning, Gabriel woke before the building's elevators had learned to breathe. He dressed by the ritual of habit, shirt pressed, tie knotted with the same 4 fingers that had tied it for years, and yet the knot felt different, as if it had been used for something other than fashion. He stood at the window while the city reassembled itself below and thought of the child at his chest, the lullaby curling around the edges of his memory like smoke. He could have treated the previous day as trivia. No one else would have blamed him. Instead, a corner of the old photograph had stubbornly insisted on being relevant. Beatrice woke to the usual chorus of small domestic noises: the kettle's hiss, the radiator's half-hearted clank, a neighbor's radio drifting thinly through the wall. She had not slept well. The mop and the cart had been put away, the day's route mapped out on the pad of a planning notebook with the pen's impatient scrawl. Cecilia stirred, thumb still half in her mouth, and Beatrice watched the child as one reads a map, careful, attentive, plotting how to keep distance from the places that hurt. She had expected to be summoned by the facilities manager, maybe to receive a sharp look or a question about work hours. She had not planned for an invitation to a man's office. That phrasing, "Bring her to my office tomorrow," had landed like an instruction and like an earthquake, both all at once. The building's reception offered the same bland smile as it always did. Security buzzed her through with a glance that said, politely, "One more." Conversation in the elevators orbiting the higher floors was built on conference agendas and the weather. Beatrice held Cecilia in the crook of her arm and kept to the edges of the flow. Sweat dampened the seam of her apron, though the cold of the lobby had nothing to do with it. Gabriel sat behind his desk with the photograph open and the kettle steaming silently in the corner. When Beatrice entered with Cecilia clinging to her shoulder like a small knot, she felt exposed the way people do when a wound needs cleaning. Everything tender, everything obvious. She kept her head down, she kept the bag with work supplies and the mop ticket tucked close. The office smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper. He rose and came around the desk without any grand gesture. He was careful not to make the room into a spectacle. He wanted the smallness of conversation, the shape of ordinary speech, where memory could be held and examined without collapsing under the weight of performance. "Sit," he said, and his voice, which usually measured company presentations, was oddly domestic. Beatrice sat on the vinyl visitor's chair as if trying to find a place that would not creak. Cecilia, who had been calm the day before, now curled inward and kept a thumb behind her teeth. The child watched the room, and the room watched her. Gabriel put the photograph on the desk, face up, as if offering a relic. Beatrice's eyes flicked to it for a breath, and then away. There was a small label on the back of the image, an old scrawl that read, "Bea," and a date. The sight of it made the blood leave some part of her face and then rush back like a tide. "I found this yesterday," Gabriel said. "I didn't know—" He stopped. He was choosing his words. "I didn't know who you were. I knew the song before I knew you were the one who sang it to Laura." Silence pooled. Beatrice thought of the nights at the hospital, of the tiny hands she had steadied, and the sound of machines that had become rhythm. She thought of not telling anyone about the lullaby, of how songs are sometimes secrets you carry because they belong to the small and private mercies you offer. "It's been a long time," she said finally, "a long time since I worked in a ward." "You were a nurse," Gabriel said. His hand hovered over the photograph, as if he could keep the past from falling apart by holding it taut. "I was," she answered, "for years." He listened without asking for more. He listened the way people do when they have learned how to hold sorrow with the gentleness it asks for, which is not the same as indulgence. It is a kind of discipline. They talked for an hour that felt like less and like many hours at once. Words moved between them in small, exact exchanges. The name Laura, given with the care of someone handling glass. Beatrice's description of the song as something she hummed when things were raw and young. Gabriel's admission that the melody had been the last sound he remembered from his daughter's bedside. There were no dramatic accusations, only the mutual astonishment at how the world repeats itself in tiny loops, how a lullaby can leave one house and find another by sheer insistence. Then came the offer. It arrived not as a grand charity, but as a solution. Practical,
carefully worded and emotionally honest. "I run a small program here," Gabriel said. "Not big. We have a need for someone who can take care of certain small things: client relations, coordination with the hospital on community outreach, keeping some of our smaller visits from becoming chaotic. I can pay well. I can make sure your hours are reliable. I can also ensure your daughter is safe while you work." Beatrice's first reaction was a muscle she had learned to use: reflexive refusal. There were reasons for that. The world had taught her a distinct code: never let your needs be the reason someone buys your pity. Charity can look like a kindness and feel like a cage. She had watched friends accept offers that came with strings. They were left with gratitude on the surface and with shapes of power sewn through their days.
"You're offering a job," she said. Not yet the acceptance or rejection, simply a way to hear the contour of his meaning. Not a favor. "Not a favor," he said. "A job. Salary, benefits, titles, responsibility. You'll be a member of the staff." She listened. She thought of rent coming due, of uniform repairs, the bakery shifts that scraped the edge of her energy. She also thought of pride, stubborn, essential, and of what it meant for Cecilia to never be reduced to someone else's charity. "What I need to know is," she paused, searching for the right bluntness, "if I work here, will someone speak to me like I belong? Will you treat me like a person, not a story to be told at the office party?" He looked at her like a man answering something that mattered. "I will treat you with respect. That is my promise." He said the words with the careful weight of a man who had once measured out his affection for pennies and realized the sum he had been missing. They negotiated details in the next days like two people building something that had to be stable enough for a small life. Beatrice insisted on days off, on written guarantees of hours, on a clause that nothing about her employment could be used for PR without her consent. She refused an initial offer of housing, saying simply, "I need to keep a place for Cecilia where things are small and known." It wasn't rejection of comfort so much as a defense of a rhythm that had kept them from being uprooted. Gabriel listened and adapted. He proposed a longer trial period of employment with a promise of review and full benefits. He agreed to provide access to a trusted backup babysitter, vetted and paid through the company, and to keep the arrangement transparent so that the offer could not be spun into a charity story. His humility in that moment was not theatrical. He understood, perhaps better than someone who had never needed to accept help, that dignity was the currency people needed most. Dona Vera, the supervisor who had watched Beatrice work for years, gave a terse nod when she learned of the arrangement. She had trained Beatrice to the job when budgets were tighter and expectations stricter. "Don't let them walk on you," she told her quietly, the phrase not unkind but direct. Beatrice promised, and meant it. The first weeks in the office were awkward in the way new, comfortable shoes often are. Stiff at first, then conforming. Gabriel learned the small practicalities of childcare that do not require training college degrees. How to find the sticker under a cereal box that would calm Cecilia, which cartoons to avoid because they sped up feelings, how to make a paper crown without scissors to avoid accidents. He made mistakes, offering a glossy treat in a sugar-crazed moment, failing to test water temperature, but he also sat in silence with the things he could not fix. He practiced being present. The lullaby threaded the days like a seam. When Cecilia started to sing it at the office nap station, other people noticed. A senior partner would look toward the nap room with an expression that had the kind of soft surprise usually reserved for birds landing near the windowsills. The security staff grew fond of her small shadow. Coffee room gossip softened into maternal tenderness that was tentative until it was real. For Beatrice, the work gave her back parts of herself she had thought resigned to the past. She found herself managing small relief operations, coordinating deliveries to the hospital, organizing volunteer days where employees could read to children, liaising with a social worker to create toy drives. Her nursing instincts,
Clinical, practical, patient, found a channel that did not require long night shifts, but did honor the piece of her that loved to steady frightened hands. Gabriel watched that reanimation with a mix of gratitude and awe. They learned one another's languages in tiny translations. He learned to ask rather than assume. She learned to accept steadiness rather than explain every loneliness away. Cecilia learned that a man's tie could be a rope to hold when the world surged. She also learned that there were adults who would not shout if she spilled juice, and that sometimes a suit could be gentle. Not everyone was quiet in their approval. The company newsletter ran a carefully worded piece about community initiatives that mentioned Beatrice as part of the team. It was meant to highlight the program's human element. Beatrice read it at home and felt the old reflex, to shrink from headlines. She had insisted on no PR, but the article had been written in a way that made her feel like a symbol rather than a person. She complained. Gabriel apologized. The copy was corrected. It mattered to him that she remain whole, not a token. The deeper tension came from elsewhere. Gabriel's mother, Donna Marta Novaes, belonged to a culture where propriety and lineage weighed heavily. Her house was a study in curated history, portraits that did not smile, silver polished in the moonlight, guests who wore their manners as armor. When her son mentioned Beatrice, her voice at first was a study of polite neutrality. "Who is she?" she asked. The question was less about identity and more about the implications of identity. In her world, reputations were a kind of currency, and they moved with careful margins. "Her name is Beatrice," Gabriel said. "She'll be on staff. She has experience with hospitals. She is careful and capable." Marta's first meeting with Beatrice was contained, perfunctory. She said the expected things, "How nice to meet you," and then settled into an observed silence. Where every sign of poverty or roughness could be noted like a strain in the fabric. Beatrice did not perform humility, and did not apologize for the threadbare condition of her apartment. She explained her life plainly: 3 jobs, a child, an old neighborhood. She made no speech of aspiration. She was simply present. At the first family dinner where Beatrice was invited not as a curiosity but as a guest, the tension pulled at the edges of the room. Marta watched Beatrice feed Cecilia with chopsticks, watched the way her hands moved, and the child listened. There was a moment when Marta looked at the photograph on the mantel, where a small framed image of Laura once sat, and saw, in the way Beatrice tilted her head to listen, a resemblance not of face, but of motion. Both women had a way of listening with the body. It was not a rapid conversion. Marta's objections were class-shaped and mortality-shaped. Fears about what a marriage to someone from outside might mean. Fears about the family's reputation. She brought up the logistics, education, inheritance, public image, in a tone that veiled worry as practicality. Gabriel answered in public. He spoke of partnership, of shared memory, of the child who had returned warmth to a house that had been a museum of grief. He meant it. He was not lionizing Beatrice nor diminishing her. He wanted both of them to be legible and real. The pivot came in an afternoon when Marta, browsing in a drawer she had meant not to open, found among Gabriel's papers a copy of the old photograph. She read the scrawl, "Bia," and stared. Then she looked up at her son in a way the two of them had not done since Laura's passing, like two people negotiating whether an old wound would be reopened, in order to heal. She asked to meet Beatrice alone. They sat in a room where afternoon light filtered through curtains, and Beatrice, who had not known to practice social polish, spoke with the blunt kindness of someone who had been composed by necessity. "Your grandson," Marta began, and then stopped, as if a stone had lodged in her mouth. Cecilia, who had been playing with a small ball of yarn at her feet, slid forward and, without much ceremony, climbed onto Marta's lap. She was small and decisive. She reached out and pulled on the edge of a scarf Marta wore without hesitation, the familiar, simple gesture of a child starting to make a claim. Marta blinked. The old woman blinked like someone looking at a mirror in which a stranger smiles back.
The photograph, the song, the child's nonchalance, they convened into something like common sense. She had watched sorrow bend her son. She had watched his life shrink. She had also watched resilience in the way Beatrice laid out the day's schedule, the way she balanced requests, and refused charity. Perhaps, Marta considered, the family needed not a theatrical rescue, but a steady hand and an honest person who understood service. She cared for Laura, Beatrice said quietly, after Marta's silence had been long enough to be a language of its own. I was there. I did what I could. I'm sorry. The apology hung between them like a ribbon. Marta had preserved the house in an attempt to keep Laura's memory visible and unassailable. She had not imagined that healing could come through an ordinary person who had known the cost of devotion. That recognition loosened something inside her. She looked at her son, at the small child who now lived in the edges of both their worlds, and she let her defenses fall in the shape of an invitation to tea. It was not instant bliss. There were awkward lunches, stories retold with small, stubborn corrections, and the occasional wrinkle of judgment that needed time to uncrease. But the pattern of someone's presence, Beatrice's steady way of showing up, gradually changed the shape of suspicion into something else. Dona Marta began to let small silences open. She began to join in the lullaby humming when Cecilia dozed on her lap. That was not capitulation so much as reorientation, an aunt finally learning a child's name and being willing to repeat it until it fit in her mouth. One afternoon, in the hospital garden where Laura had spent quiet afternoons in her final months, Gabriel walked with both women. It had become a place of ritual for the family, an attempt to keep the difficult memory from gathering moss in corners. Beatrice moved slowly between the beds of flowers and the benches, and Cecilia chased bees with a solemnity that made the nurses smile. Gabriel and Beatrice spoke then of things that had been too heavy in smaller rooms, the possibility of something more permanent. He did not wear grand language. He wore steadiness. I can't pretend she's a replacement, he said. I won't. I shouldn't. You are not Laura. You are Beatrice. And... he swallowed. Words like, I love you, gather weight in the mouths of people who have been bereaved. They must be small and true. Beatrice looked at him the way those who carry their own map look at someone asking the way. I need to know you mean it, she said, that you're not patching your life because it hurts, that we're not a project. She stated her conditions plainly: honesty, respect, shared decision-making, and an ongoing commitment to keep her independence. He nodded and offered the only thing he had practiced in private: constancy. I will be present, he said. I cannot promise there won't be hard days. I can promise I won't walk away. Their decision was not a sudden leap. It was a series of small agreements, legal and emotional. Careful talk with lawyers to create a structure for joint guardianship, a conversation with HR about formal adoption paperwork to be initiated without fanfare, and a family meeting where lines were drawn and promises made. Beatrice insisted on a clause that allowed her to return to nurse training hours if she chose, and argued for the ability to volunteer at the hospital without it being construed as a conflict of interest. Gabriel agreed. On a gray afternoon, thick with rain, as if the weather themselves kept waiting to witness, Gabriel asked Beatrice to marry him. He did it in a way that fit him. Private, precise, with no flourish that would make the moment about spectacle. He knelt by the hospital garden bench, not because he had to kneel to prove anything, but because some actions are small and symbolic and still worth doing. She laughed in a way that sounded like surprise and relief. Is this a test? She asked. No test, he said. Just a question. Will you marry me? Will you build this, us, if we try? She thought of the mop, the hospital corridors, the child who had grabbed his tie like a rope to shore. She thought of the dignity she had fought to keep. She looked at him and saw a man who had learned how to kneel without drama. She said yes. They married months later in a low, unshowy ceremony in the hospital garden. Friends from work, A few nurses, security guards who had watched Cecilia grow, and a handful of executives who had been part of the small program attended. The ceremony used few words and many presents. A choir of people who had become steady. Laura's photograph sat on a small table adorned with flowers. Cecilia, given a tiny bouquet, walked with the solemnity of someone being taught an ancient duty, to remember and to go on. Vows were simple. They were not promises to erase grief. They were promises about presence. Gabriel spoke of keeping room, a phrase that would become their shorthand for what marriage meant in that house. The willingness to leave spaces open for memory, for doubt, for love, and for the child who would continue to ask for care in unexpected ways. Beatrice promised to bring her own tenderness and her fierce insistence on dignity. They spoke of babysitters negotiated in advance, of days for Beatrice's work at the hospital, and of the practicalities of life that true love often shrinks to: menus, finances, and nights when the sleeping child's breathing had to be checked. Dona Marta stood in the back with wet eyes and a smile that had the smallness of an admission. She had been wrong to assume charity and right to see that family can look different than the storybooks. She placed a hand on Beatrice's shoulder as if handing over an old coat. It fit. After the wedding, they began the slow, legal work of adoption. There were forms and meetings, and a judge who asked them questions that felt like small weighings of soul. The process was not a drama. It was a bureaucracy that tested their patience rather than their love. They sat across from officials with carefully prepared paperwork and made the case that this was not rescue theater, but rather a family being formed by mutual choice. When the final signature was made, Cecilia's name was legally another thing to hold, paper that matched the living child's existence. In the months that followed, the house in the city that had been Gabriel's retreat filled with daily noise. There were drawings on the refrigerator, mismatched socks in the laundry, and an earnest effort to learn how to braid hair without breaking it. There were also the ordinary quarrels. Beatrice's impatience with certain corporate manners, Gabriel's reluctance to attend certain neighborhood events that he found performative. They argued. They made up. They practiced patience as if it were an instrument that took time to master. Beatrice returned to the hospital not as a nurse in a ward, but as a coordinator and a volunteer. She ran workshops for parents who had been in Laura's position, teaching them how to sing to a child who might be too small to respond. Her work at the hospital created a bridge between the foundation Gabriel had started and the community the institution served. In a small ceremony, the hospital named a pediatric reading room after Laura, a place where children could come and hear stories. The plaque read simply and quietly, and Beatrice touched it with fingers that had once folded blankets for frightened families. The public response was mixed, as it always is for stories that complicate neat narratives. There were articles that praised the corporate program and others that questioned whether privilege and poverty could mingle without one side being consumed. They weathered the commentary. They focused on afternoons together, on the small liturgies of coffee and homework. Gabriel learned to remove his tie at the end of every workday and set it on the banister where Cecilia could eventually begin to play with its silk. He came to think of the tie not as a symbol of status, but as a thread that had led them to each other. One afternoon, a year after the first pulling of the tie, they assembled the small group that had been important along the way. Nurses who had worked shifts with Beatrice, security guards who had watched Cecilia grow, Donna Vera who had been the one to employ her before, and a few executives who had learned to see people as more than profiles. They walked into the hospital wing together for a dedication service. The new wing bore Laura's name above the door in modest letters. A plaque recorded in simple words the wish of memory, that care would continue. Beatrice stood before the gathered people and, without flourish, spoke a few sentences. She did not speak of herself as a heroine. She spoke of practical things: how families needed presence, how hospital staff needed rest, how a song, a small routine, can be a refuge. Her voice was steady. Tears came after, quiet and shared. Later, when the guests had gone and the lights had been turned down, she stayed behind for a moment and ran a hand along the plaque. It was warm from the day's sun. She thought of the child she had held in a white fluorescent room and of the small girl who now sings in an office nap room on the 23rd floor. She thought of the man who had given her a job and a promise and the life they had cobbled together with honest hours. The final scenes of the year were ordinary in their blessing.
Mornings were now a cascade of school runs, office briefings, and the small scramble that morning routines always require. Dinner conversations included talk of homework, of a television show a toddler found ridiculous, and of a hospital committee meeting Beatrice would attend. They learned the quiet rhythm of an ordinary family that had been assembled out of grief and choice. Cecilia, who had been terrified of strangers and startling sounds, now walked into rooms with a confidence that came from being carried through storms. She would sometimes cross a room and reach for Gabriel's tie, not out of need, but in the small way children claim what makes them safe. Gabriel had come to welcome this gesture. When she did, he would loosen the knot and, for an instant, hold both their hands as if marking a promise that had already been kept. One evening, as winter pressed cold at the windows and the house smelled like soup and crayons, Gabriel sat by the living room lamp with his tie unfastened. He held the photograph of Laura in his hands and watched Cecilia asleep on the couch with a toy tie draped across her knees. He loosened his own tie all the way, and then, with a small, private movement, threaded it into a loop and set it on the table beside the photo. It was a small ritual. For him, it kept that first pull of fabric from being a singularity. It became, instead, a continuing knot tying their family together across memory and presence. They chose, in private, to speak of that first moment without claiming supernatural language. It was easier to say that the moment had been meaningful than to pin it down to providence. They liked the humility of ambiguity. Beatrice sometimes said, smiling, she just liked silk. Gabriel would laugh, and at night they would both hum the lullaby in the spare hours, a two-part harmony for two lives that had learned to listen. Once, on the anniversary of the day Cecilia had pulled the tie, a small paper butterfly was found tucked into the book on the hospital's reading shelf. No one claimed it. It felt, to the people who noticed, like a small sign, an inconsequential thing made significant by the way grief and love keep sending reminders to be gentle. They did not call it a miracle. They did not need to. It was enough that someone had thought to leave it, that someone else had found it, and that it made them all look at their hands and at the work they were doing. Years later, friends would recount the story as a quiet miracle of sorts, how a child's small hand could shift trajectories. But those who lived it knew the fuller truth, that no single pull of cloth created a family. It was many small acts carried out consistently, a promise kept, a refusal to be ashamed, a job negotiated without humiliation, a mother who sang songs, and a man who learned how to kneel and how to sit in the long now of presence. Years later, friends would recount the story as a quiet miracle of sorts, how a child's small hand could shift trajectories. But those who lived it knew the fuller truth, that no single pull of cloth created a family. It was many small acts carried out consistently, a promise kept, a refusal to be ashamed, a job negotiated without humiliation, a mother who sang songs, and a man who learned how to kneel and how to sit in the long now of presence.
The tie remained as a motif in photographs. A man loosening it at home, a child tugging at it playfully, a ribbon at Laura's plaque where a friend had tied it in memory. In the end, the tie was less an object of fate and more a thread of continuity. It had been grabbed and held and loosened. It had been used as a symbol in speeches and as a toy on the carpet. It had been the slender line that connected a cleaner's life to a family's heart. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest, most ordinary gestures, singing a drawn melody, bending down to smooth a child's hair, offering someone a steady paycheck, are the architecture of restoration. When the narrator traces back to that 23rd floor morning, it is not to assert that there was an answer to be found in the child's certainty. It is to note how people, who had been reduced by sorrow and by system, made a decision to keep each other steady. They did not promise to heal everything. They promised to show up. On a late summer evening, with the city settling into a sound like distant waves, Gabriel sat on the stoop with Cecilia in his lap. She had learned to hum the lullaby without being prompted. His mother, now gentler and kinder in small increments, hummed along. Beatrice passed them on her way home from a workshop at the hospital and stopped to hand Gabriel a mug of tea. He looked at the knot of his tie in his lap and gently looped it around the photo of Laura that had long ago found a permanent place on a shelf where it could be seen rather than hidden. They chose to believe that some things, small objects, songs, the decision to hold steady, carry their own quiet meaning. But they left room for randomness, for ordinary chance, for the ways lives quietly overlap. The child who had once avoided strangers learned the language of belonging. The man who had measured life by loss learned to accept the messy, vivid business of family. The woman who had scrubbed floors and hummed to children found that her work, in a different form, had always mattered. If you remember only one image, let it be this: a tiny hand on a silk knot, the tie pulled, not to command, but to anchor, and a group of people who, because of that pull, decided to keep one another's rooms open. If you are moved by this story, like and subscribe for more real-life stories that honor the quiet work of healing. And if someone you love needs to hear about second chances, share this with them.